Hi, students. This video is going to be about Buddhism. We have gotten introduced to Buddhism through a contemporary American Zen master, but we haven't yet talked about kind of the origins of Buddhism and how Buddhism has been practiced in different parts of the world for thousands of years. And so what I want to do in this video is talk about sort of some basic tenets of Buddhism, and then go into Buddhist art, because this week I'm hoping you will make some connections between some images of the Buddha and instructions to the cook. So this will just give you a little background about Buddhism, and some of what you learn here may resonate with what you've been reading about in instructions to the cook. So here we go. Many people refer to the historical Buddha as Shakyamuni or Siddhartha. And he was born into a life of pleasure as a prince in an Indian royal family. And his family sort of, you might think a lot about how in Instructions to the Cook, Bertie Glassman talks a lot about welcoming everything in, the good and the bad, and working with all the ingredients, even the ingredients you may not be feeling that welcoming to. Well, the origin of that sort of ethic in Buddhism comes from the life of the historical Buddha, whose family, when he was growing up, gave him a life of luxury and tried to protect him from anything kind of negative in the human experience. So his, one account of his life that he gives, what he says: I was delicately nurtured. At my father's residence, lotus ponds were made just for my enjoyment. In one of them, blue lotuses bloomed, in another, red lotuses, and in a third, white lotuses. By day and by night, a white canopy was held over me so that cold and heat, dust and grass and dew would not settle on me. I had 3 mansions, one for the winter, one for the summer, and one for the rainy season. I spent the 4 months of the rains in the rainy season mansion, being entertained by musicians, none of whom were male, and I did not leave the mansion. So that was what his life was like growing up. However, something important happened at around age 22. The historical Buddha Shakyamuni sees suffering for the first time. He leaves the palace where he has grown up, and he sees what are famously known as the 4 sights. And one of those sights is he sees an old man. So he realizes he's going to get old. He also sees a sick person. He sees illness for the first time, and he sees death. He also sees a holy man. Sometimes the holy man he sees is referred to as an ascetic, and we'll talk about asceticism in just a little bit. So after Siddhartha sees the 4 sights, suddenly he becomes obsessed with finding the answer to the problem of suffering, because one of the problems of human existence is that we do suffer. We do get old, we do die, and we suffer a lot between birth and death, for all sorts of reasons. And suddenly Siddhartha wanted to understand, or to find an answer to the problem of suffering. But he knew that if he stayed in the palace, he would find no answers. It is said on the night his own son Rahula was born, he left the palace for good in search of an answer. He got up quietly, kissed his wife and newborn son, woke Chana, that was his attendant, and they crept past the sleeping guards and silently rode away from the palace. When they both reached the edge of a river, they dismounted from their horses. Taking his sword, Siddhartha cut off his hair and swapped his rich clothes for the clothes of a beggar. He gave all his rings and bracelets to Chana to take back to his father. Chana watched as Siddhartha crossed the river and disappeared into the forest on the other side. By giving up his possessions and the symbols of his previous life, Siddhartha was letting go of the things that he thought were keeping him ignorant, and thus resulting in his suffering. Later, he was to teach that renunciation, a letting go, was important in reaching enlightenment. So the first way that Siddhartha tried to solve this problem of suffering was through asceticism. And ascetics basically denied themselves food, denied themselves water, denied themselves sex, any kind of human physical need they tried to work against, because they felt like to be truly holy, they could not give in to these urges. And so here are some images of ascetics. And you can see how skinny they are. And it was a way of kind of denouncing desire, I guess. But it didn't really work. The Buddha was trying, he was meditating under the Bodhi tree, and he was denying himself food and water, but the Buddha was not finding a solution to the problem of suffering through asceticism. Under the Bodhi tree in Bodh Gaya, he practiced special techniques for developing wisdom and achieving enlightenment, but was still not enlightened. Then, and this is an incredibly important moment in the history of Buddhism and in the story of Buddhist life. He's sitting under the Bodhi tree, meditating, denying himself food and water and all these other things, and it's not working. And then a local lady comes by and brings him rice. Sometimes this is translated as a milkmaid bringing him milk, but however it's translated, he gets some kind of sustenance, milk or rice. And that after he gets that milk and rice or rice, he reaches enlightenment. And one of the ways that's kind of commonly understood is that enlightenment doesn't come from denying the needs of our physical body, but embracing our humanness and embracing, that because we have a human body, we need food and drink. And only when he embraces his body as a human being is he able to reach enlightenment. And he begins to understand the interconnectedness of himself to the world, and he attains enlightenment. So it's a new view of how to reach enlightenment. Asceticism is not the answer for the Buddha and in Buddhism. Buddhists believe we must embrace our physical bodies and its needs as part of our existence because we are not gods, we are humans. Out of this moment of enlightenment, the Buddha develops what are called the Four Noble Truths. The first is that life is suffering. Now that can sound really depressing, but one way I tend to think about it is, another way of saying it is, throughout our lives, we have a tendency to want things to be other than they are. For example, I may be sitting in English class, but I really want, to be at In-N-Out Burger getting my lunch, or I may be, going to work when I'd really rather be lying in bed. So one way of understanding the truth of life is suffering is that we have a tendency as humans to want things to be other than they are. and that creates a good deal of suffering. Number two, suffering is due to attachment. I'm really craving, I'm attached to this idea of my In-N-Out burger, and that's what's causing my suffering. I'd much rather be eating my In-N-Out burger than be listening to an explanation of how to avoid a sentence fragment in English class. So my suffering is because I prefer one thing over another, or I'm attached to one thing over another. The third noble truth is attachment can be overcome. And the fourth noble truth is there is a path for accomplishing this. So in other words, we have this tendency to want things to be other than they are. It's caused by preferring some things over another, but there's a way to reduce or even eliminate this attachment if we follow certain steps. And those steps are what are referred to as the Eightfold Path. I think Bernie Glassman talks about the first one. Right view is the true understanding of the Four Noble Truths. 2, right aspiration is the true desire to free oneself from attachment, ignorance, and hatefulness. These two are referred to as prajna or wisdom. Right speech involves abstaining from lying, gossiping, or hurtful talk. Right action involves abstaining from hurtful behaviors such as killing, stealing, and careless sex. 5, right livelihood means making your living in such a way as to avoid dishonesty and hurting others, including animals. Bernie Glassman talks about right livelihood in Instructions to the Cook. These 3 are referred to as Shila or morality. Right effort is a matter of exerting oneself in regards to the content of one's mind. Bad qualities should be abandoned and prevented from arising again. Good qualities should be enacted and nurtured. 7, right mindfulness is the focusing of one's attention on one's body, feelings, thoughts, and consciousness in such a way as to overcome craving, hatred, and ignorance. 8, right concentration is meditating in such a way as to progressively realize a true understanding of imperfection, impermanence, and non-separateness. The last 3 are known as samadhi or meditation. So those are sort of the foundations. The Four Noble Truths and the Eightfold Path are sort of the foundation of Buddhist thought. And you may they may kind of remind you of certain moments in Instruction to the Cook. So now we're going to talk about some aspects of Buddhist art with a focus on images of the Buddha. Just as we've talked about art in other sections of the class, when we talked about Romanticism, when we talked about, the Age of Enlightenment. I want to touch a little bit on the art that has come out of Buddhist thought. So Buddhism evolves and it is interpreted differently by different people in different places. It started in India, it spread to Japan, China, Vietnam. There are also specific, there's a little typo in my PowerPoint. It should say specific interpretations of Buddhism, such as Zen Buddhism, and different foci among different sects of Buddhists. Buddhism is very flexible. It changes according to where it spreads. It accommodates itself to different cultures very easily. And one example of that is there's a great story of a man who erected a Buddha in Oakland, California. And you can listen to this podcast about how that affected the community. The Dan Stevenson, the man responsible for erecting the Oakland Buddha, is not Buddhist, but he's a peaceful person. And his story and the story of the Buddha of Oakland is a great example of how Buddhism takes different forms in different places. one of the things that, and again, Bernie Glassman refers to this in Instructions to the Cook, one of the things that's highly valued in Buddhism is what's called the middle path. The great appeal of Buddhism is its teaching of wisdom, compassion, and humility. Its emphasis on moral and ethical perfection, a democratic outlook, and a casteless society also widened its attraction. A Buddha is a being who has achieved enlightenment, the ability to understand the true nature of all things, and has been released from samsara, which is the wheel of suffering. Buddhism spread in part because it was not location specific. Believers did not need to worship at a particular temple or at a particular site as part of their practice. Bernie Glassman talks about bringing our spirituality home. He talks about how Jewish people practice in the home, and he encourages us to practice Buddhism in the home, that we don't have to go to a special place to be practicing. Worship could take place anywhere and at any time. This freedom resulted in the emergence of Buddhist art throughout Asia and eventually through much of the world. So these are some of the places where Buddhism spread: Malaysia, Indonesia, Thailand, Japan, the Philippines. The earliest Buddhist art we know is aniconic. That's a great word. It just means art that does not represent the icon of the Buddha. The Buddha was not depicted in human form for some 400 years after his death. By the way, the historical Buddha lived sometime between 563 and 483 BC. He was represented instead by various symbols like a wheel, a shrine, a tree, and footprints adorned with the marks of his design nature. These footprints became a popular symbol across the Buddhist world for his earthly presence and continued to be made and revered after images of him became widespread. And there are lots of different theories about why the Buddha wasn't depicted in human form for those 400 years. Some people think there were images of the Buddha then, but they were not preserved. Some people think that it was maybe seen as disrespectful to have images of the Buddha. Different theories about that. But eventually images of the Buddha became widespread. And you can see some here. And one thing I want you to notice as you look at these is the positions of the hands, which are called mudras. We're going to learn about these this week, and you're going to describe some different mudras. To fully appreciate the variety of these different Buddhas, it's important to understand more about some key characteristics of them. The Buddha is often depicted sitting on a lotus flower. And you can read about the significance of the lotus flower in Buddhist art by going to this link. But I will just tell you the key thing to understand about the lotus flower is that the lotus flower grows and thrives and blossoms in mud. So it is often considered a kind of metaphor for Buddhist practice, that we grow peaceful and loving by being mindful and following a spiritual practice in a world that is often dirty and mucky and not peaceful. The suggestion is that if a lotus flower can thrive in mud, we can thrive in a world that is often messy and dirty. Sacred hand gestures called mudras are very important in understanding different images of the Buddha. To learn what different mudras mean, you can go to this link. I've also put the links, these links in the on the page of our discussion about images of the Buddha, so you can look at them there too. The pose a Buddha is in these images is very significant, and each pose has a different meaning. So you'll see standing Buddhas, sitting Buddhas, lying down Buddhas. To see how different images of the Buddha can emphasize different aspects of Buddhism, check out this video of art historians discussing some different Buddhas in the collection of the American Museum of Natural History. So there's another link for you. Whoops, I'm starting the video and I do not mean to be. There we go. So you're going to do some reading about the significance of the lotus flower, the significance of the different mudras, the significance of the different poses and images of the Buddha. And then you're going to sort of reflect on all of this and how it might relate to instructions to the cook. You're going to take part in a discussion this week. And here's what you need to do. You need to find an image of the Buddha that you like. You can look on the internet or in a book or in a museum collection. Lots of, if you look up the Metropolitan Museum of Art or even the Huntington Museum here in LA, you will find different images of the Buddha. So you're going to find an image of the Buddha that you like, that is compelling for you. You're going to identify its location and who made it when, if possible. It's not always possible to do that, but if you can. Describe its pose, the mudra the Buddha's hands are in, and whether or not your Buddha is sitting on a lotus flower, and explain what these aspects of your Buddha might suggest about its purpose or meaning. So to do this, you're going to need to read, you're going to need to follow the links here in this PowerPoint, but these links are also on the page where the discussion begins. So if you want to just click on them there and explore them, that's great too. But you're going to need to learn a little bit about the different mudras through following these links, learn a little bit about the different poses by following these links, learn a little bit about the lotus flower by following these links. And then after you've done that, you're going to describe its pose, the mudra, whether it's sitting on a lotus flower, explain what these aspects of your Buddha might suggest about its purpose or meaning. And then I want you to draw a connection between the Buddha you selected and a sentence or passage from instructions to the cook. So that is what I want you to think about this week. Now that we've read about how a man in the 20th and 21st century in the United States interpreted Buddhism in his work as a cook and his work as an activist fighting homelessness, I want you to reach back and look at these images of the Buddha and see if you can find any connections between these images of the Buddha and Zen master Bernie Glassman and his thoughts and reflections on Buddhist practice and cooking and fighting homelessness. Let me know if you have any questions or concerns.